I mean, when you look at the literature, there aren't almost any work on schizophrenia besides one professor from Turkey, from Istanbul, that did a lot of work on, and I met him once in a conference here.
Tanju Surmeli.
Yes, Surmeli.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, what is your approach? What is your knowledge from seeing a lot of EEGs? If you treated some schizophrenia patients, etc.
Schizophrenia doesn't have a single presentation. There's been some early work on it quantitatively by Roy John's lab at NYU, now under Leslie Prichup's guidance since Roy's passing, and they basically found some over-arousal, lower voltage, faster EEGs and beta spindle EEGs. But one of the more recent studies that I kind of appreciate ends up being one where they actually look at psychosis, schizophrenic psychosis. They found a third of the people with psychosis have epileptiform content in the EEG. And if you give somebody that has epileptiform EEG content an antipsychotic, it makes them worse. If you don't look at the EEG, and if you walk into the hospital and you're psychotic, broken with reality, it isn't like they suddenly suspect they should do an EEG always. They'll give you an antipsychotic medication because you're psychotic. But a third of them, it's a mistake. If you don't actually look at the brain function before you decide on your course of treatment, you might have somebody that has something totally different. Inflammatory change in the brain from something. I mean, there's other things, but 1/3 of them will have epileptiform content. You can see easily, and it changes the course of therapy. You use an anticonvulsant instead of an antipsychotic, and the patients turn around very quickly. I had a short bit of work I did with the U.S. military as a no-bid contractor. It took a long time to get the status of a no-bid military contractor, but they could then send us EEGs to look at, and we could give them results without having to go through competitive bidding for every EEG report. And they gave us 6 clients to see whether we could give them any benefit. And of the first 6 clients, 3 of them were temporal lobe epileptics. The odds of that are almost impossible. I mean, I would have bet a lot that we wouldn't get 3 temporal lobe epileptics if you just drew 6 clients. But the first one was hearing voices, and he was a Marine. The voices were telling him to kill people, and they weren't his commanding officer. They were inside of his head. These weren't like command voices from outside from a military supervisor. These were voices in his head telling him to kill people. And if you tell somebody that you're hearing voices telling you to kill people, they'll probably give you an antipsychotic. And they did, and it got worse. So eventually they sent the data to us, and we spoke to the attending physician and said, you've got to take this guy off of the antipsychotic drugs. You're telling a psychiatrist that their psychotic patient needs to come off their antipsychotic drugs. This is a big risk. I mean, if I take the patient off these drugs and he does something, there's a gigantic liability. People blame me for whatever he does. We realize the liability, but at the same time, you got a patient and they're being mistreated right now. So really, your liability is a secondary consideration to your client's health. And the doctor put him in the brig, the military prison, basically, in order to take him off of his antipsychotics without having the liability for the psychiatrist, and to put him on anticonvulsants, and the voices went away. So it worked very, very well. This repeated itself 2 more times out of 6 people. And as such, we got an open-ended invite to process for them. That went until sequester, which was a cutback on outside contractors for the military. And So we lost half of the business for the company all at once. But we were expanding our business so fast, I was happy to shed the half that we got rid of, because we had more people to serve. You can see another group here: mood disorders. Mood disorders, 3%. 3%. That's like the normal background population incidence of randomly finding some discharge of some sort. But if their mood didn't make sense, and their mood's going to make sense to them, but if it doesn't make objective sense to somebody outside of them, at that point, a third of them had epileptiform discharges. You could view the mood problems as pseudobulbar affect. Temporal lobe discharges give you out of control emotions. The old term is not appropriate anymore for diagnosing an epilepsy, but it's descriptive: a fit of laughter. Well, the term fit is the trigger. I mean, the person's not having fun laughing. They're not laughing at something that's funny. They're hysterically laughing, and they would just as soon not be laughing. It's out of control, and they realize it quite often. A fit of anger, where they're acting out a rage event. These kind of mood things can end up being epileptiform in nature. So we've got to be aware when somebody is behaving in an unreal way, a psychiatric disturbance of some sort. There's a good chance, if 1 out of 3 people are going to have epileptiform content, don't you think you should look? Yes. Because it's going to dramatically change their treatment that's appropriate to match them. If they're just full of beta, you can wind them down. If they're under aroused, you can wind them up. But if they have this kind of an instability, you've got to stabilize them. Mm-hmm. Once you stabilize these discharges, if they're stable and they are not discharging, the network that makes them will finally fade away. If you don't use it, you lose it. If you fire together, you wire together. Those are 2 basic processes within the brain. And every time you make a discharge, it's easier to make that discharge. And it might make a little bit more turf involved as well. It might add in a little piece. But every time you make it not work, it slowly sheds a spoke and a hub in the network that makes it may fade away. You might still have a focus, but it may not have a network. And at that point, you're asymptomatic. So we work very hard on people that have psychiatric presentations to make sure that they don't have epileptiform content. If they have it, we treat that directly. If they have overarousal or underarousal, that's easily dealt with neurofeedback. Neurofeedback teaches you to increase or decrease your arousal level quite readily. It's been one of the applications that have been done since the early days. Lubar used to do CZSMR, FZ beta. Authmers did C3 beta and C4 SMR, and then they started to reach out in some other areas. But the basics since the late 80s, early 90s have been able to teach control of arousal level. And Sterman's work on SMR and the European work on slow cortical potentials in epilepsy apply directly to these kind of discharges. So we really have the tools to manage these psychiatric disturbances. If we see what they are, we can match the protocol to their presentation. If you don't look, you're making some assumptions, and the overarousal, underarousal, not that hard to spot usually, but the epileptiform content is awfully hard to predict, and it doesn't always show as convulsions. The psychiatric disturbances of pseudobulbar affect are an example of that. They're not having a convulsion. They're having behavioral manifestations, and not as easy to spot.